This past weekend was the big DC Fandome event, where DC released a whole bunch of new trailers and announcements and stuff like that. And of course, in that, there was a new trailer for Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, the video game. Hopefully. I say hopefully because, admittedly, I'm filming this the day before the event happens, so I'm just banking on the fact that there's going to be another trailer for that game to justify me doing another episode of famous cartoon characters on the Suicide Squad. But even if there wasn't any new Suicide Squad news or trailers or anything, I'm sure lots of people will be happy to have another episode in this series, because it's one of my more popular series now. Anyway, regardless of what happened at DC Fandome, let's get into this, shall we? Let's go. Hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show. Being born a metahuman isn't always what it's cracked up to be. Sure, sometimes you'll get incredible abilities, strength, speed, invulnerability, things of that nature are all certainly possible, but many are not so lucky. Some are born looking like what many in the world would refer to as monsters. Mike Wazowski was one of these less fortunate metahumans. He was born with green skin, horns, and, most obvious of all, with one massive eye in the center of his face. And as is so often the case, when you spend your childhood years being called a monster by your parents and society, you inevitably become one. At least for a while. Mike ran away from home at an early age, fending for himself out on the cruel streets of Gotham, but he did have a stroke of luck when he was around 10 years old. He was taken in by a member of the Falcone crime family. They were one of the largest, most prolific gangs in Gotham, and they saw opportunity in young Mike. See, they'd heard rumors that a rival family, the Maronis, had taken in a monstrous blue-furred, bulky metahuman of their own, and were raising him to be their muscle against any who'd challenge them. The Falcones hoped to do the same thing with young Mike, but he didn't exactly grow up to be particularly intimidating. He was a funny guy that made everyone laugh, and they generally enjoyed having him around, but by his late teens he'd barely grown to be 5 feet tall and could hardly pack on any muscle. In a confrontation where a group of the Maronis were facing some Falcones, they sent Mike in to fight, and he was absolutely pummeled by the Maronis' towering metahuman Sullivan. The family was discouraged, but not for too long. When they realized he couldn't be their muscle, they redirected Mike to a new task. They'd send him against a smaller target, one they knew he could handle. They told him to break into the Maronis' mansion and kill Maronis' granddaughter, a girl of just over 4 years old. Mike was hesitant, but didn't want to disappoint the only people who'd ever taken him in, and at least somewhat accepted him. He got onto the Maroni property and hid in the kid's closet just before she was laid down to sleep. A few hours later, he crept out of the closet, totally unsure if he could actually do what he'd been told, when he noticed through the dark that the kid was actually awake. She flicked on her light and just looked at him. She didn't scream or run or anything, she just looked, as if he was a totally normal person. She wasn't put off by his appearance at all. He was confused and nervous and tried to break for the window when he stepped on a toy car and flopped onto his back, releasing a nervous belch as he hit the floor. The girl laughed raucously. It was the greatest sound Mike had ever heard. Not only was there no chance he could kill this child now, but hearing her laugh sparked a realization in Mike. He wanted to be a child's entertainer. His happiest moments had always been when he'd made anyone in the Maroni family laugh, and now hearing it from a kid, paired with the total lack of judgment he felt from this young girl, made him sure that making kids laugh was his true calling. Unfortunately, where he'd soon end up, there was a significant shortage of kids to entertain. See, the noises Mike was making drew the attention of the house's metahuman guard, Sullivan, who stormed into the room. Mike fled out the window but was chased away from the mansion by Sullivan, where they were both soon spotted by civilians who called the police. They were soon both arrested, and their ties to the gang families got them both incarcerated in Belle Reve, where they just so happened to be cellmates. There were tensions at first, but as they slowly started to get to know each other, they eventually saw that they had more in common than they thought. Sullivan too had enjoyed entertaining Maroni's kids, and had only ever committed crimes or hurt people when he felt he had to secure his place in the family. They both made an agreement to work together. When they got out of prison, they'd start their own business, or pitch a show, or something like that, and finally live their dreams together, regardless of what the world thought of their appearance. Of course, first, they had to get out of Belle Reve, and the fastest way to do that was, well, you know. Luz Noceda wasn't a bad kid, but she didn't always make the best decisions. One decision that pushed those around her over the edge involved her bringing a box of live snakes to school for a project, not realizing one was poisonous. It escaped and put a classmate in the hospital, and Luz was set to be sent off to juvie. Her mother couldn't care less, as she was already sick of her daughter's constant antics, but Luz wasn't going down easy. She ran away from home before she could be taken in and decided to hide out initially in an old abandoned home that had been boarded up in the woods not too far from her mom's. It was only meant to be a temporary lodging, but after a few days of being there, something happened. A magical door appeared and opened in the house. Out stepped a pale, gold-fanged woman who was alarmed to see Luz there. This was Ida, a witch who came to Earth regularly to steal artifacts to sell back where she lived, in Azarath. Azarath was a magical realm between the planes of reality. It was a place that had once been destroyed by the demon lord Trigon, but since then, Trigon himself had been defeated, and coincidentally was now embodying a current member of the Suicide Squad, and Azarath had slowly been rebuilt by outcasts of other realms. Beings and creatures who'd found their way to Azarath and wanted a place where they could run away from their problems and start their lives over. This, of course, sounded perfect to Luz, who yearned for adventure and had no interest in staying in her world to be carted away to juvie. Ida agreed to bring Luz there and give her a place to live if she worked as Ida's assistant. The deal was made, and soon Luz was doing whatever dark deeds the witch asked her to do. Luz even started teaching herself magic, which she found she could perform by writing different runes and glyphs onto paper. Luz loved these wild years she spent in Azarath. She even found love in another young witch named Amity. Unfortunately, Ida wasn't the best influence on Luz, but having never had a mother figure who genuinely cared about her, Luz ate up every morsel of Ida's philosophy of taking whatever she pleased so long as she had the power to back it up. As she and Ida grew more and more adept with their magic, they became bolder and started trying to take new territory in the chaotic world that was Azarath. But there were those that were trying to bring a form of order to the once proud land, and they couldn't let Luz and Ida continue to grow in power. A man who was trying to get a foothold as the Emperor of New Azarath called upon the help of a daughter of the realm, now spending her time with heroes on Earth, Raven of the Teen Titans. Raven was in favor of order being brought back to Azarath, so she helped the Emperor and his forces take down Ida and Luz. Recognizing that Luz was from Earth, Raven took Luz back with her, leaving her with no way to return to Azarath, as interdimensional travel wasn't magic she'd learned yet. It was too advanced for her. Luz fought ruthlessly against Raven to try and force the Titan to take her back to the only people who had ever cared about her. But Raven thought Luz needed time away from Ida to realize what a bad influence she'd been. Raven hoped to talk sense into Luz, but it was clear Luz wasn't willing to listen or back down. Somberly, Raven had to defeat Luz and had her locked up in, well, you can guess. Luz now needed a way to get out of prison and dive deep into learning new magic so she could get back to Azarath and free Ida and Amity. So, to complete step 1 of that plan, she of course had to strike a deal with Amanda Waller to join Task Force X. The streets of Gotham ain't a place for folks without any grit in their teeth. Catch someone's eyes with the wrong sort of look and you could end the night picking your teeth out of the gutter. If you have teeth, that is. See, that wasn't a problem for old Perry. Being a humanoid platypus certainly caught some weird glances, but he'd learned to always hold his own in a fight. See, Perry had once been a regular old pet platypus to some kids who are sure to grow up to eventually be evil geniuses. They spent all their time experimenting on animals and building weird death machines way too advanced for normal-minded kids. But these kids would never have been considered normal by anyone, except maybe their parents, who somehow were oblivious to the insane experiments these kids made. One day they took things a step too far and tried to give sentient consciousness to their little pet platypus, and surprise, surprise, they succeeded. course, by the end of the day, they were done with him and moving on to their next experiment, so they booted Perry from home, and the newly intelligent creature was left to fend for himself. Old Perry quickly realized he stood out in a crowd. Folks didn't take kindly to him, especially in a town like Gotham, where meta-human monsters were always running around causing trouble. He lived on the streets for a while, trying to stay in hiding. He even stole himself a trench coat and a hat to try and hide his appearance the best he could. But a giant bill in turquoise fur skin tended to draw the eyes, no matter what you wore. Living in Gotham streets toughened him up really quick. He learned how to fight and eventually started getting paying work as a private investigator and got a reputation for being a PI that wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. Of course, he tried to be a just guy, you know, walk the line, be a good man. But when you're paid to keep an eye on enough bad guys, sometimes you end up becoming one. A recurring job he got was to keep an eye on Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz, an evil, well, genius might be the wrong word, but he was a criminal inventor that was low tier enough that Batman wouldn't even waste his time on him. Perry was only paid to watch the guy to see if he was having an affair with the wife of his client. He watched Dr. Doof for weeks on end, saw him constantly failing to build any machine worth a cent, until one day the guy finally finished one of his rays, one that he gave a juvenile name to, the Shrinkinator. It was supposed to be used to shrink a bank so Dr. Doof could take the whole building, get the money out, then put it back. Problem was, the thing went off on its own before he was ready. Shrunk the building, but also made it crumble in on itself, killing everybody inside, hundreds of people. Now, maybe it was because he'd caught Perry on a bad day, or maybe the salty platypus was just tired of watching the goon fail all the time, but watching Dr. Doof kill a building full of people finally made Perry snap. He left his perch, busted into Doofenshmirtz's lair, and beat the bumbling doctor to death. Of course, in Gotham, there's a certain Dark Knight that doesn't take too kindly to capital punishment. Perry was scrappy, but Batman was way beyond anything he could handle. I'm sure you can guess the rest. Belle Reeve, Amanda Waller, and the squad got its newest member. The early days of Danny Fenton's superhero career were rocky at times, but he consistently improved his abilities to become a fairly adept hero. He regularly kept his hometown of Amity Park safe from ghosts, demons, and any other threat that came his way. He even on occasion teamed up with the Teen Titans and started building up his name in the hero community. By the time he finished high school, he felt like he'd become skilled enough and got his name out enough that he may be able to achieve his ultimate goal of joining the Justice League. They'd recently recruited Cyborg of the Teen Titans, so he thought surely that meant he had a chance of joining their ranks too. His powers were formidable. Being half phantom, he could turn invisible, shoot ghost rays, fly, had super strength, durability, and he even gained abilities like cryokinesis. He'd gotten stronger and stronger over the years, and felt he could hold his own against even the toughest of the Justice League's villains. But they weren't so sure. He got himself an audience with some of their members to see if he had a shot, and the response was mixed, but mostly negative. Martian Manhunter was brutally honest and said Danny just wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility, and that someone like Darkseid could snuff him out in a second. Wonder Woman was less harsh but agreed that Danny wasn't there yet, and that there were hundreds of heroes who were more eligible to join their ranks. Danny was distraught. He'd put all his chips into joining the League. His grades had consistently slipped, and he hadn't applied to any universities, plus had no interest in any real-world jobs. He'd wanted to be an astronaut once, but now that seemed so minuscule compared to the things that he could do. He decided he'd just have to train more, push himself harder to learn more and more abilities. He decided to do what many people do after high school and take a gap year abroad. But he went to a very different place than any others would choose to go. Danny got some help altering an interdimensional portal that his parents had built when he was younger, one that had given him his powers initially. He reworked it so that it could now take him to Apocalypse. This was the realm of Darkseid. It was a hell-like planet full of powerful, monstrous beings and beasts. He saw this as throwing himself into the supervillain deep end. If he could survive there, surely he'd become strong enough to prove himself as worthy to join the League. But he barely survived there for months, nearly being killed daily and fighting off everything he could. He was eventually captured by the Furies of Granny Goodness and forced to fight as a slave in her training arena. He was on the brink of death daily, but his powers did grow and grow. His ghost half became more demonic. He started to leak ectoplasm that eventually he started to use as an acidic attack to melt through his enemies and slowly turn them into mindless undead drones. Soon, he was unable to turn back into his human form, and his ghost form looked like an undead husk of its former self. But in a way, he had achieved his goal. He was remarkably powerful, and was even able to fight off Granny Goodness herself to escape the pits. He managed to teleport himself back to Earth after 2 years, and he went straight to the League again to show them what he could now do. But they were more concerned than impressed. They thought it outrageously reckless that he'd gone to Apocalypse, and worse still, they said they couldn't trust him, as it was entirely possible Darkseid or Granny had turned him into a puppet for their own doing, maybe even without him knowing. Furious and gone more than slightly mad by his time in Apocalypse, he outright attacked the League. Part of him thinking that he could prove to them he was worthy by defeating them in battle. But it was obviously twisted logic, and while he did put up quite a fight, he was eventually bested. The once hopeful hero was locked away and completely enraged. He was still senselessly set on impressing the League somehow, and decided he'd go back to Apocalypse and put Darkseid's head on a spike to prove his might. But of course, first, he'd have to get out of Belle Reve. Super fun doing another round of this. And I got to work with some characters that people had been asking me to use, like Danny Phantom and Luz from Owl House, and Perry the Platypus. And Mike Wazowski I'd considered using for the past few episodes, and I, just finally got around to him this time. So what do you think? Do I do a round 5 of this? I mean, I probably will at some point, but, I might wait a little bit again. But give me suggestions for who you'd want to see in another episode of this if I do another one. Which I probably will. And of course, if you're new to the channel and you haven't seen any of the other episodes, you can check out the other 2 famous cartoon characters on the Suicide Squad, or the famous anime characters on the Suicide Squad. But besides that, that's all for today. I'm Christian Pearson, this has been PopCross Studios, home of the nerdiest art videos on YouTube. Thank you so much for watching, everybody, and I will see you all in the next episode on Friday. Goodbye.